Good morning and welcome to our first in a new series of webinars focused on advertising, brands, copyright and designs. A few people are still joining, so we'll take this slowly while they do so. We considered a cheesy title for these webinars, given that they're about advertising, brands, copyright and designs of the ABCD of IP. But being brands lawyers, we felt we better not be too tacky. We usually hold these events as a full morning seminar in our office, as many of you know, and I'm sorry that today we can't offer you breakfast or coffee. Hopefully you've managed to get one yourselves. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do the catering. At the end of this webinar, I'll provide you with further details of forthcoming webinars that we are hosting. The next one being on brands and trademarks, and that's in November. We'd love to have your input on the event today, especially as we're talking about things that are current in terms of the pandemic and relevant to a variety of different types of businesses, all of whom have different perspectives. Please do provide your comments and questions as we go along in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen. We will either try and cover the points as we go along or at the end where we've allowed some time for questions. We may not get to every question during the course of the webinar today, and if we don't get to yours, we will get in touch separately after the event. Just to let you know, we are recording this webinar and we will send you a link next week so that you can share it with any colleagues who might like to see it. At the end, a feedback form should pop up magically. I'd be very grateful if you could fill that in, as we really do take account of all comments that are made, good and bad, to help us to tailor future events as to what you'd like to hear about. Right, that's enough parish notices for one day. I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dan and Kate. Dan Smith is our head of advertising law and an expert in everything from helping clients with marketing campaigns through to negotiating major sponsorship and partnership agreements. Kate Hawkins is a senior associate in our advertising team who previously worked for a major brand before joining our team a few years ago. Both Dan and Kate are working closely with Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games on all aspects of sponsorship, advertising and marketing. And with no further ado, you'll be relieved to hear I'm going to hand over to Dan.
Okay, so advertising during the pandemic. How do you keep your, and if you're an agency, your clients' brands in consumers' minds during a global pandemic? It's a tricky challenge, to say the least, which the ad industry has had to deal with over the past few months and is still dealing with. And meanwhile, the advertising regulators have also had to keep up with changing public concerns. So they've been moving to reprioritize when and how they intervene in what is obviously a very different world. So advertising, which was on brand and which was effective before lockdown, could suddenly seem entirely inappropriate as we went into lockdown earlier in the year. So this was perhaps the most unfortunately timed ad campaign of all time. Can we see the next slide? So a few short weeks prior to lockdown, KFC launched this 2-minute film, and this was a film which consisted entirely of shots of people licking their own and other people's fingers. Something which obviously suddenly seemed very wrong in the light of government messaging about hand washing, face touching, social distancing. And the ASA received over 160 complaints about that particular ad. But, and if we look at the next slide, and this is typical of KFC, for those of you who remember how they turned a positive out of their chicken delivery issues a couple of years ago, the advertiser fronted up to the challenge. So they didn't just quietly back away from finger licking good, as many other advertisers would have done. Instead, they made that change the centerpiece of their next campaign. So you can see that they've pixelated out finger licking there and just left it's good. And every other advertiser too has been reshaping their campaigns over the last few months to deal with the new normal. So we've seen some neat uses of some of the world's most famous brands to address things like social distancing. So here in this next slide, the Audi rings are distanced. And we saw something very similar from McDonald's, also from VW. And of course, we've seen many advertisers encouraging people to stay at home, promoting COVID-safe measures in their stores, or rushing to join the praise for the NHS. This next one is one of my favourite examples, though it's actually a fake. And John's gone early with the slide there. I was going to warn people who were watching Netflix's Love is Blind to look away before we got to this slide. But the concept, and we can see it now, which went viral, was that people who weren't already staying at home during lockdown might be encouraged to do so if Netflix were to run a billboard campaign just running spoilers from their favourite shows as headlines. And as I say, that one there is from Love is Blind. It wasn't real. It turned out to be the work of some advertising students. Elsewhere, it's felt like the time has come for some ideas. So in the case of this next slide, this kazoo ad, buying a car from your sofa, something which would have seemed unusual, to say the least, before, buying a car without having had the opportunity to see it in person. And many automotive manufacturers were already looking at direct-to-consumer and e-commerce offerings, but the pandemic has certainly emphasised the need for businesses to boost their e-commerce presence across the board. Next slide, please. And the nuts and bolts of advertising production have also clearly been very heavily affected. So shooting let's say a glossy car ad on the Bolivian salt flats has suddenly become a whole lot more difficult. And brands have had to fall back on other alternative solutions. This is a nice example from the United Arab Emirates, a Honda ad, which looks initially like many other car ads, close up on the design as the car speeds past the screen, until you see that the car in question is actually driving across a carpet in front of a washing machine. It's a toy car. Next slide, please. Brands have also fallen back on advertising in digital and social media. So this is quite a nice example. This is IKEA posting its in-store restaurant meatballs recipe in the style of its own flat pack furniture instructions. And then on the next slide, so brands have also been turning more to user-generated content. And there is advertising law risk there, of course, in having users producing content which is uncontrolled by the brand, but which has official hashtags attached. So there's a potential danger of a reputational impact. And where the brand subsequently engages with that content, by reposting it or liking it, then the Advertising Standards Authority will treat the brand as having assumed responsibility for the advertising compliance of that messaging. So there is some risk there. But again, this is quite a nice on-brand example where that risk is controlled by the nature of the activity. So it's made seeking users' photos of their own home design style. We've also seen a lot of ads making use of businesses' own staff working from home, as well as their customers. I've seen a lot more charitable promotions this year, benefiting NHS charities and others. Here's an example of the Co-op using its staff to promote donations to the Fair Share charity. And the next slide is BrewDog moving into new areas, as many brands have, and producing hand sanitizer to give away to those that need it. The next one is a slightly more unfortunate example. So this was a nice idea for a campaign. This is O Poly. That's the name of the brand, rather than a sigh from me. What they did was they ran a campaign for key workers, a competition for key workers, and the prize was a Zoom cocktail party and a goodie bag in connection with that. So they would send the winners a dress and some other trinkets and items for them to wear at this Zoom cocktail party. But as it happened, one of the nurses who won was working a 12-hour shift, actually on a ward, dealing with actual coronavirus patients at the time of this Zoom cocktail party. So when she asked them what they could do about it, the brand said, well, sorry, better luck next time, effectively. And she asked if she could have the dress, and they said, no, that's just for the people who are able to attend the party. So that's a way to turn something which was quite a nice idea initially into a bit of a PR disaster. It's made headlines in the national newspapers. And then, of course, as we came out of lockdown, and even before then, we've seen brands looking to return to normal with their advertising. So you might have seen the Strongbow campaign on the next ad, which looks like it was shot in a completely different world now. So how has this unprecedented situation affected advertising regulation? Well, the Advertising Standards Authority has had to deal with a huge amount of new complaints about health and medical claims, and it's therefore reprioritised its activity. So on the next slide, it announced an approach of regulatory forbearance, what it called regulatory forbearance, stating that, and you can see the wording on the slide there, the ASA is very conscious that in this time of national crisis, it must act sensitively and with due regard to the circumstances faced by businesses and members of the public. In practice, this means applying a lightness of touch in some areas, and in other areas, an uncompromising stance on companies or individuals seeking to use advertising to exploit the circumstances for their own gain. So what's that meant? How have we seen that working? Well, we certainly haven't seen a reduction in our own ASA complaint caseload. Complaints about ads are still very much being picked up by the Advertising Standards Authority, and not only in coronavirus related areas. So to take just one example, I've seen a lot of complaints over the last few months and formal investigations into environmental claims. Nothing to do with coronavirus, just the ASA continuing to pick that up as a priority issue in a business as usual way. But there have also been fewer formal ASA council rulings over the last few months, and a greater willingness on their part to resolve matters informally and to engage with advertisers even before a complaint is officially picked up, perhaps outside their more usual structures. But there's certainly been opportunities to minimise the PR damage associated with an ASA intervention. On the flip side of that, of course, the ASA has been very quick to take action on complaints about non-compliant advertising of things like hand sanitizers, face masks, purported remedies and infection control measures, and on anything which it has interpreted as irresponsible scaremongering. And it's not just the Advertising Standards Authority there, the Competition and Markets Authority, Trading Standards, the MHRA, the medicines regulator, and the Health and Safety Executive have all been very active. So there's definitely a need for extreme caution before you put out any advertising linking products to protection against infection. And the social media platforms too have been active in that space, and they can often respond more quickly than the statutory regulators. So Facebook, for example, banned ads for hand sanitizers and wipes for a period, though it's scaled back those restrictions now. Next slide. So I'm not going to say too much about this slide on trends in ASA complaints as compared to last year, and that's mostly because it's not all that surprising. So for example, there's been fewer complaints about travel ads this year. Now, I'm not altogether surprised about that. Presumably there's been less travel advertising due to less possibility of traveling. So automatically there would be less complaints. But it is interesting to see a spike in complaints in the health and beauty sector. And I very much assume that is directly COVID related, and again emphasises the need for caution in any kind of health and wellness claims. So moving on to the next slide. So what do you need to bear in mind when looking at campaign concepts during the pandemic? Well, firstly, and as we've seen, is the campaign appropriate in the pandemic? Is it going to chime with consumers, or is it something which is going to look completely out of place in a pandemic environment? Do you need to revise the creative, could it be viewed as irresponsible in the light of shifting government guidelines? So fortunately, the Advertising Standards Authority has laid out a pragmatic stance on these kind of issues in a series of guiding principles. So if you just flick ahead to the next slide, we can take a look at those. So what the ASA has said is that ads which actively discourage protective measures, such as mask wearing or social distancing, are likely to be irresponsible in all circumstances, and therefore a breach of the CAP or the BCAP code. And the ASA will be likely to investigate these ads with a view to banning them. Now, I don't think this is going to come up very often for your businesses. It's likely to be a minority who face issues under this principle. This is probably not activity that a responsible advertiser would engage in. So it covers things like directly discouraging people from wearing masks, but it also potentially covers mocking mask wearers. And CAP has cited as an example, having some people on a tube train, picturing some people on a tube train wearing masks while an inspector comes past, who then take their masks off after the inspector has gone. But it's not something which is likely to come up accidentally, and therefore is probably not so much of an issue for reputable brands. The second guiding principle is perhaps more of an issue. So what we're looking at here in the ASA words is ads which are responsibly created and which make explicit reference to the existence of the pandemic. And those ads must show depictions of social distancing, the correct use of face masks, and other protective measures in line with government guidance. Now, this is more difficult because inevitably agencies and marketing teams and the brands themselves are going to want to acknowledge the circumstances that consumers are living, their lived reality. And even just referencing in your advertising these challenging times or these unprecedented times could bring you within this principle. And so if you do that, you may well then have to ensure that everyone in the ad is compliant with current government guidance. And there's obviously difficulties with that. So in a sense, it was easier when everybody had to stay home. There's different national restrictions across the different territories of the UK. There's different regional restrictions. We've got the different tiering. And I would expect the Advertising Standards Authority to be pragmatic about that, but nevertheless, it's going to be difficult to get creative right. And there's still a risk there, and a wider issue potentially from a marketing perspective of potentially confusing consumers as to the guidelines which apply to them or provoking complaints. And then the third bucket is ads which are responsibly created but which do not explicitly reference the existence of the pandemic. And those wouldn't be likely to need to depict coronavirus protective measures. And what the ASA has said about this is that they recognise that consumers will understand that ads often depict realities that might not completely align with their experience of real life. Unless those ads explicitly reference the virus, they're not likely to be seen to discourage or undermine current safety measures if behaviour which is normal in the ads version of reality is shown. So from the regulatory perspective, the safest approach is probably just to ignore the crisis and set your ads in a normal non-pandemic world, positioning them as unreal. The difficulty with that is obviously that it doesn't chime with consumers' reality. And that may be an issue for the audience and therefore an issue for your marketing teams and your agencies. And secondly, when consumers see something which doesn't comply with government guidance on screen, they're going to complain about it. And you'll have the hassle of dealing with those complaints, even if the ASA doesn't ultimately uphold them. So thinking back to that Strongbow ad, which I showed earlier, that very much falls within this bucket. But on the TV ad, Strongbow had still included an on-screen super to alert consumers to the fact that that ad was shot at a time when distancing measures were not in place. And they're doing that with a view to heading off potential complaints. So moving on to the next slide. There's also obviously practical difficulties in getting a new advert shot under these conditions. So insurance companies are not insuring against COVID-related disruption, and the advertising agencies through their trade association, the IPA, production through the APA, and advertisers through ISBA have therefore negotiated this new tripartite production agreement, which deals with risk mitigation and effectively passes off the financial risk for disrupted productions to advertisers. And many advertisers have not been happy with that. But equally, on the agency side, the agencies are keen not to be in a position where they're effectively insuring their clients. So what's the best solution there? It's probably to consider all the different creative concepts, but come up with something where risk can be mitigated to a significant extent and make sure all parties are complying with those risk mitigation measures. One other thing to think about, corona washing. So this was a story in The Guardian a few months ago. It said corona washing, for big bad businesses, is the new greenwashing. Who's who of polluters, tax dodgers, and outsourcing vultures are urging us to stay safe, clap for the NHS. Now, that was quite a hard-hitting article, but it does illustrate the potential for a backlash where your creative concepts include some kind of nod to the pandemic or some kind of social responsibility related elements. So moving on to the next slide. So just to finish up this section, we'll skate through very quickly through a number of particular issues. Promotions were obviously significantly impacted by the first lockdown. Prizes were not available as planned. Businesses are now having to look to offer different prizes in their competition. So clearly you won't be seeing many holidays given away as prizes this year. Availability, under GAP guidance and the CAP codes, you have to make a reasonable estimate of likely demand for offers and stock to meet that demand, or explain the limitations on demand. But there have been limitations on demand, limitations on supply, which have affected businesses being able to meet demand through their offers. So what do you do then? Well, you have to look to take steps to cease advertising. You have to consider what else can be done to avoid disappointing consumers. Can you offer an alternative? Extending closing dates. So the Advertising Standards Authority generally frowns on the closing dates for offers being extended because it considers that people who saw the original closing date were misled. They could have taken longer to make their purchase decision. It may be that you're forced to extend closing dates if your offer is or the availability of your offer, or if consumers' ability to take advantage of your offer is impacted by some kind of local lockdown, perhaps a local circuit or a circuit breaker. But that doesn't mean that just because times are uncertain, you can extend offers because they prove more successful than you'd hoped or less successful than you'd hoped. The ASA is still going to frown on extensions in those circumstances. And then on the next slide, just taking a look at a few particular sectors. So health and well-being has raised a lot of issues. So are you making any kind of coronavirus claims or immunity-based claims? The MHRA has said that if you are claiming any product treats a named pathogen, then that is, such as coronavirus, then that is a medical claim, and the product which is making it should be authorized as a medicine. So you wouldn't be able to make those claims with other products. You might be able to say something lesser, something lower key, something less direct with a biocide or a cosmetic in accordance with the applicable regulations in those sectors. Food and drink. So be very careful here. Claims to treat disease are banned, and claims to benefit the immune system are health claims and are only permitted insofar as they appear on the central EFSA register. Gambling is an area the regulators have been focused on for a slightly different reason. So there are plenty of activities which are quite highly regulated, where you can't show people engaging in them at work, and you can't risk portraying them in a socially irresponsible way. So the regulators have very much had their eye on the gambling industry to make sure that no one's taking advantage of the current lockdown and showing people gambling irresponsibly at home alongside remote working or whatever else. And to a lesser extent, similar issues apply in the case of alcohol and other highly regulated products. Fashion. Are you marketing masks? Well, be aware that masks could be regulated as medical devices. They could be regulated by the Health and Safety Executive as personal protective equipment, or they could be mere face coverings. And that's going to affect what you can say about them in marketing. Retailers, more than anyone else perhaps, need to promote COVID safe measures in their particular premises. And so they are perhaps impacted by the most by having to show people attending their premises in a COVID safe way. Subscription services have seen a big boom over the course of lockdown, but be aware that misleading consumers as to the nature of what they're getting engaged in, what's known as subscription traps, is problematic, and therefore there is the potential for regulatory issues there too. So overall, I'm sure we're going to see plenty of creativity over the winter as advertisers and agencies become more adept at messaging through a pandemic situation, but there are many traps for the unwary, and that could be a particularly acute issue where you're moving into new business models, new products, or new modes of marketing. And given the potential reputational impacts, I'd say that businesses would be very wise to keep one eye on marketing compliance throughout this period.
Thank you, Dan. Passing over to Kate now. Kate, if you want to unmute and turn your camera on. Over to you.
Great, thank you. So, of course, to follow on from what Dan was saying, one area that has been particularly important during the pandemic is influencer marketing. Social media usage is up and people are consuming more content, which influencers can create quickly. So it's not surprising to us that brands are looking to spend more on influencer collaborations. So turning to my new favourite influencer, John, here is a bit of trivia to kick us off. So I'm sure a few of us were delighted to see Sir David Attenborough join Instagram a few weeks ago, especially with such an important message. According to news reports, his total following rose to 2.5 million within 24 hours, and he reached 1 million followers in 4 hours and 44 minutes, beating Jen Aniston by half an hour. So we might see more from Sir David, especially given the fact that influencer-related content isn't affected in the same way as content created by production companies, as Dan mentioned before. Although influencers have been a popular marketing option for many brands over the last few years, the pandemic has been a driving factor in encouraging brands to develop new business models and new ways of contacting consumers. So for example, one chain of nail salons, which of course was shut during lockdown, completely reinvented its business model. It moved to selling false nails online and worked very heavily with influencers to promote the sales of those false nails. It's a great example of a business evolving to face the new challenges. And if you're going to do that, then you need to understand the rules of the new marketing and sales models that you are adopting. So this is a timely opportunity to run through the rules on influencers. Influencer marketing is subject to the CAP code and also the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations, the CPRs. The CAP code is enforced by the ASA and will apply to most influencer marketing. In particular, Rule 2.1 of the CAP code says, marketing communications must be obviously identifiable as such. The CPRs contain a schedule of commercial practices which are in all circumstances considered unfair, and they are prohibited on that basis. In particular, using editorial content in the media to promote a product where a trader has paid for the promotion without making that clear will be unfair. The Competition and Markets Authority enforces this consumer protection legislation. Both the ASA and the CMA have been very active in this space so far. So John, if we turn to the next slide. Brands and influencers have been criticised here in the UK and around the world for putting out messages which appear to be the unprompted, genuine opinion of the influencer, but are in fact disguised advertising. Trust is key for both brands and influencers. No one wants to make their customers or followers feel cheated or tricked when they discover that what looks like an independent recommendation is actually marketing. That's where the regulators will step in. The ASA has a two-stage test when it comes to deciding whether something an influencer posts is an ad. It will ask, has there been a payment from the brand to the influencer? And secondly, has the brand had some form of editorial control over the influencer content? Payment is treated very broadly and will include money, but also money's worth. So think about things like free products, discounts, loaner cars, special access to events, or other kinds of privileges. And when it comes to editorial control, the ASA's adjudications tell us that control is broader than we might think. So here are some examples, if we can go to the next slide, John. Nomad Foods, i.e. Flat Tummy Tea, had a financial agreement with Shake Beauty. She was sent products which she was required to photograph and post on Instagram. Nomad Foods did not provide specific wording or copy, but they did ask Shake Beauty to base her content on key messages, such as the 20% discount offer that you can see in the caption. That was considered to be editorial control. And because there was a financial arrangement as well, the ASA considered this to be advertising. Without a clear identifier, such as the hashtag ad, which you can see in the revised post, which is on this slide, the ASA concluded that this post was not obviously identifiable as a marketing communication in breach of the CAP code. So when thinking about control, you should ask yourself, am I providing key messages or themes to the influencer? Am I requiring them to be positive about the brand? Am I asking the influencer to include campaign hashtags or post an unboxing? Am I preventing an influencer from posting about other brands? If so, then that will be control. If both stages of the test are met, being payment plus control, then the influencer content will be advertising for the purposes of the CAP code. So what do you do then? Both the brand and the influencer need to make sure that the post is labelled correctly. And if we go to the next slide, we can see some examples. So here, a complaint was made to the ASA that this post was not obviously identifiable as a marketing communication. There was a commercial relationship between Daniel Wellington and Louise Thompson, who's pictured here in the Maldives, I believe, set out in a written contractual agreement. Louise agreed to promote Daniel Wellington's products by posting to her Instagram account, and she was paid in return. Daniel Wellington had stipulated hashtags to be used by Louise, such as hashtag sponsored and hashtag ad, but they were not included in the original post. The ASA concluded that this was advertising. Louise had been paid, Daniel Wellington had sufficient control over the content, and it breached the code because it did not include a clear identifier such as hashtag ad. Now, it's worth remembering that even if you have a contract with an influencer that sets out the hashtags to be used, and the contract requires them to comply with all applicable advertising rules, the brand will still ultimately be responsible and will be named in an adjudication, just like Daniel Wellington was. So one thing we're seeing at the moment with some clients is ensuring that the client has the right to approve the final post. That way, you can do a final check for compliance. We go to the next slide, please. In this post, Olivia Buckland has tagged the fake brand company, Coco Brown, and also included some hashtags, including hashtag brand ambassador. Someone challenged whether this post was obviously identifiable as an ad. The original post didn't have the hashtag ad that we can see at the end of the caption here. Olivia Buckland explained that she had used the brand ambassador hashtag in the post and also in her Instagram bio. But the ASA was not convinced that Instagram users would see Olivia's bio at the point they were viewing this post. They also didn't think that the brand ambassador hashtag was likely to convey that Coco Brown had both paid for and had a level of control over the post. And if we go to the next slide, please. So the point about brand ambassador was looked at again earlier this year. Molly May posted this image with the caption, "AW, I'm ready," with a little brown leaf emoji. As with Olivia Buckland, Molly May identified herself as an ambassador for Pretty Little Thing in her Instagram bio. The ASA acknowledged that Molly May's followers might be aware that there was a commercial relationship with the brand, but because this label was in the Instagram bio only, it would not be seen by people who didn't visit Molly May's account and who only saw this post in their feeds. The ASA will look at this point on the basis that people who are new to the influencer will not necessarily know the background and the relationship that they have with certain brands. When people see something in their feed, they don't always visit the influencer's profile. And the ASA will be concerned that these people will be misled, even if the long-time followers know about the brand relationship. And I think we can skip over the next slide, John, and go to the next one. Thank you. So this was an early adjudication about a video post on Millie McIntosh's Instagram account in 2015. The caption reads, "80s voguing times yoga at House of Yoga. More of my #blend recommends with @drinkJ20 spritz to come, #SP." The ASA did not think that #SP was sufficient to make this post obvious as an ad. And in fact, last year, the ASA published a report of its findings on consumer understanding when it comes to labelling something as an ad. That report said that consumers' understanding of abbreviated labels like #SP or SPON or AFF is very, very low. We know that the sponsored label is considered to be sufficient in other jurisdictions, but it will not be accepted in the UK. We do see it regularly coming up in influencer posts, but the ASA takes the view that just because content is sponsored, it doesn't necessarily mean that the brand has control over it. So for example, you could be sponsoring a football team without picking the actual players, or you could sponsor a weekend pull-out magazine without preparing any of the content that people will read. But if the brand does have control, which Britvic did have here with Millie McIntosh, then using the sponsored label will not be enough. So while this adjudication is from a few years ago, it is still very relevant. We now tend to advise clients to go with #ad, as this has become the de facto standard. The positioning of this #ad label is also very important. The ASA has said that it will expect the label to be above the fold or at the beginning of the ad. It must be prominent and not buried in a series of hashtags, or only seen after a consumer has engaged with the ad. So if we look at the next slide, this was a video posted back in 2014, making this one of the very first ASA adjudications on influencer marketing. 2 YouTube stars filmed themselves taking part in an Oreo lick race. Originally, the text beneath the video, which was only revealed when a show more button was pressed, stated, "Check out the Oreo site for more licking action," with a link. "Thanks to Oreo for making this video possible." A BBC journalist complained whether this ad, amongst a few others, was obviously identifiable as an ad. The ASA did not think the description was sufficient, especially because it had to be opened by a viewer. So as a takeaway, we always recommend to clients that when their influencers are posting ads to YouTube or similar platforms, the title of the video and the thumbnail, at the very least, should include an identifier such as ad, so that it is clear to consumers before they click to watch the video that it is advertising. Now, I've given labelling a lot of focus, but it's important not to forget that if the influencer content is advertising, then all of the CAP code rules will apply. For example, if you're advertising alcohol, then the influencer shouldn't post a picture of themselves and their friends being drunk. You should also pick an influencer whose followers are over 18 and make sure as part of your due diligence that the influencer isn't of particular appeal to under 18s. We go to the next slide, please. So this is a recent ASA decision and it was published just last month. And for those of you who don't know, and I had to look it up, Luke Mabbott is a former contestant on Love Island. So we can see that Luke has posted using hashtag ad, but the issue here was whether this post had been inappropriately targeted. Ads for alcohol must not be directed at people under 18, and a medium should not be used to advertise alcohol if more than 25% of its audience is under 18. Ultimately, while the ASA acknowledged that the post may have appealed to some under 18s, it did not consider it to be of greater appeal to them than those who were 18 plus. The ASA also looked at Luke's Instagram account and concluded that his account wasn't of particular appeal to under 18s. So overall, global brands could show that significantly less than 25% of the audience were under 18. So this was fine. But this gives you a bit of an idea of the kinds of things the ASA will be looking at. So moving on, if you're a car manufacturer and you lend an influencer a car, the influencer should not show themselves or post about driving over the speed limit or irresponsibly. And you should definitely not ask an influencer to advertise a prescription-only medicine. Just last week, the ASA published an adjudication about Skinny Jab and Gemma Collins, which John gave a little sneak view of. So a complaint was made about Gemma's Instagram posts. Gemma posted a story in which she stated, and I'm not going to try and do an accent, "Working on my summer body whilst in isolation, and this really helps me. This is what you get when you've ordered from Skinny Jab, and it does help. It really does help. Cannot wait to be out of lockdown in a nice summer dress." The story also featured the Skinny Jab guide booklet, which we can see in the image on the left. And next to the booklet was a box with the pre-filled injection. Advertising prescription-only medicines to the general public is strictly prohibited. The injectable Ozempic, pictured here, is a prescription-only medicine. So the ASA concluded that this story breached the code. The decision also concerned labelling. Skinny Jab explained to the ASA that its contract with Gemma had expired in December last year and had not been renewed due to the COVID-19 lockdown. They said that it had been agreed with Gemma's agent that they would resume their working relationship when restrictions were lifted, and that whatever Gemma said or did during this period of downtime was nothing to do with Skinny Jab. Skinny Jab argued that the Instagram story was not advertising because it did not arise from Gemma's contractual obligations. The ASA concluded that whether or not Gemma had been paid for this actual story did not mean that that story was not an ad. They noted that Gemma was featured on the Skinny Jab website, and the ASA did not see anything from Skinny Jab that directed Gemma to change her social media activity during the pause. So even though this story was not requested by Skinny Jab, it reinforces the point that the brand will still be seen as having control if a relationship has been on foot, meaning the post will still be advertising. Of course, many of you won't be in the pharmaceutical field, but this illustrates how normal advertising rules will apply. So whether you're advertising hand sanitizers, cars, retail stores, sunglasses, or whatever else, these rules will apply not only to the materials that you pay an influencer to post, but also to whatever else the influencer posts for free during your commercial relationship for up to 12 months from last working with you. So where you have payment by way of free products or a surprise and delight or an ongoing commercial relationship, but no editorial control, then the Competition and Markets Authority comes in. As I said at the beginning, it is an unfair commercial practice to use editorial content to promote a product where a brand has paid for that promotion without making that clear. The regulators say that consumers need to know about the commercial relationship between the influencer and the brand because it affects their behaviour, i.e., a person might be induced into buying something that they might not otherwise have bought. So even when you don't have any control over what the influencer is posting, for example, you might have sent them something with no strings attached, as a brand, you should still make sure that anything the influencer posts is identifiable as being paid for, and the influencer discloses that they got that gift from you. So as you can see, there's a lot of things that you need to keep in mind, both from a brand perspective, but also from an agency or influencer perspective. It's crucial that all parties do their due diligence when selecting partnerships. No one wants to damage their reputation. We know this kind of activity offers a big source of income for influencers, and the wrong brand fit might have an impact on an influencer's future brand partnerships. Likewise, a controversial influencer might not be the best fit for your brand. So if we go to the next slide, we can see some examples where it's gone wrong. YouTube star PewDiePie on the left there was in Forbes' highest paid YouTubers list in 2016. After a number of anti-Semitic jokes and racial slurs, Disney and other brands severed ties with him. Logan Paul on the right is another very successful influencer. He posted a video of himself near a man's body at a popular suicide point in Japan. This prompted significant criticism across the internet and left brands to question collaborations with him. So clearly, you need to take care when selecting your partners. Once you've done your due diligence and you're happy to associate your brand with the influencer's brand or vice versa, depending on which side you sit on, then you should look at getting a contract in place. We produce template influencer agreements for our clients that cover off on the key regulatory issues. These are easily filled in by the commercial team, especially for those quick, low-value campaigns. When it comes to negotiation, especially for the bigger partnerships, we tend to mostly see things like the influencer's liability, whether the influencer will be working with you exclusively or not, and the extent of the brand's approval rights negotiated. Influencers often want to keep editorial control, which is understandable. They don't want a brand to try and change their tone of voice. And often if you take a step back, you can see that you've approached this influencer for a reason. If they have a big and loyal following, that's often because they have kept their own personal style. And that's what a brand really wants to harness. So to help ease that process, we also produce a do's and don'ts list for influencers when it comes to posting on social media. We also have a policy for the brands team so everyone knows ahead of time what they should and shouldn't be doing. Because at the end of the day, brands want to reach less accessible audiences and generate goodwill, and influencers want to keep growing. So if we go to the next slide for a roundup. Thank you. So as we've said, you must be transparent with consumers and label content with #ad if there has been payment and some kind of editorial control. As we have seen, the ASA is likely to interpret control very broadly. You should also be transparent about the commercial relationships for up to 12 months. If we go to the next slide. And you mustn't forget that if the post falls within the ASA's remit, then all of the advertising rules must be complied with. This is especially important if you're advertising regulated products like alcohol or gambling. One way of protecting yourself against all of this is to make sure you do your due diligence on the influencer and put the right paperwork in place. John, I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Did you want to mention your last slide about Little Mix?
This was just in passing, and Dan shared this with me actually. So this is an example where an agency has provided some proposed copy to Jade from Little Mix, and she has done a strong copy and paste. So it even includes the agency's instructions. How's this copy, Jade?
Brilliant, brilliant. Just goes to show that it's very easy to make mistakes when doing this sort of thing. Thank you, Kate and Dan, very much. If you could just ensure that if you have a question you'd like to ask in the last 10 minutes we have of this webinar, please do send it over now. I will start with some of the questions we've already received. The first one is to do with when you're working, a lot of this stuff we've talked about, and Dan, I hope you're there too. If you can join us again, that would be great. A lot of the stuff you've talked about is very much focused on companies who might be dealing directly with the influencers and people promoting your social media. Do you have any tips for companies who work with agencies who run social media campaigns on behalf of clients, but also some of those agencies, I know, Dan, can offer sort of ad tech solutions to increase traffic and so on. If you've got any sort of particular, I appreciate that's a topic in its own right, but if you've got any sort of particular things that clients and companies should watch out for in those sorts of situations? Do you want to share them now?
Yeah. So well, it depends. It depends on the individual issue. If it's a deal between an advertiser and an agency which will be contracting influencers on the advertiser's behalf, then a lot of the same concerns which Kate has mentioned will arise. So the contracting will potentially be slightly different, potentially be through the agency, but the advertiser will still want to be clear that the content which the influencer produces is appropriate, is correctly labelled, because otherwise it's the advertiser which would suffer the brand damage if there were an issue. For digital agencies more generally, for the programmatic advertising space, well, there are various concerns that both parties need to work together to address in any contract. So the Information Commissioner has expressed various concerns about the way personal data is dealt with in the programmatic advertising space, and both clients and agencies will be concerned to ensure that any issues there are correctly addressed. There has traditionally been issues or misunderstandings around transparency in supply chains around digital media, and who and where is getting remunerated by whom. So agencies receiving bonuses or benefits back from media owners, and whether those are disclosed to or audited by their clients. So there's plenty of issues to deal with, but they can all be covered with an appropriate contract in place. So brand safety is another one. You don't want your digital advertising placed alongside decapitation videos or whatever else. So again, it's a question of looking at what solutions are available to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Dan. Lots of questions, so we'll try and get through them all. A comment on the Little Mix post. I thought that might inspire some questions. Would you, if you are promoting effectively your own brand, such as Little Mix, I appreciate not if you're a company with a corporate identity, but if you're Little Mix and you want to promote your own content, do you have to use the hashtag ad element in that situation? Yes, it's their own brand, but obviously in reality it's products produced by a third party. So what's your recommendation in relation to that?
So potentially the answer is yes. So the regulators have tended to be relatively relaxed about content brands put on their own feeds. So if you are a beverage company and you put some kind of content on your own feed, then the regulators take the view that people will understand that is likely to be advertising. But if you are an influencer or a celebrity, then you're essentially posting from different perspectives. So sometimes it's just your own thoughts, and other times it might be advertising. So the ASA has considered various complaints about influencers who've posted about their own licensed products without making it clear that that is the case. And yes, in those circumstances, they have looked for a hashtag ad label in a similar way.
Thanks, Dan. Have you had any clients specifically asking for advice in relation to uploading videos on TikTok? And if so, what are there any particular considerations in that area, or is it similar to the other social media channels?
It's similar. So TikTok likes to present itself as an entirely new model, but it presents similar issues. Yes, we've had a lot of questions about TikTok and about TikTok celebrities. Similar issues arise around sort of clear labeling of content, which is in effect paid for advertising. Also seen a number of misunderstandings about people's ability to use third-party copyright music and the like in TikTok videos. So the impression that that might be okay within TikTok. So I wouldn't say the issues are specific to TikTok. It's more a question of applying the same principles in a platform which works in a slightly different way.
Thank you, Dan. We're running out of time, so just perhaps time for one more question. Many brands, obviously, a lot of the influencers we looked at there are the sort of mega influencers. Many brands actually use very low-level influencers. Sort of, if you're selling baking products, you might sell to sort of family-led influencer blogs and things like that. On one level, the considerations will be the same, and I know that Kate recommended both, obviously, legal, but also probably more importantly, practical do's and don't sheets for influencers. But is there anything else that people should be thinking about if they are engaging in a sort of mass low-level influencer campaign where you don't have time to negotiate a big contract with the one influencer? If you're doing it with a big influencer, you're focusing on that one like a big collaboration agreement. But if you've got hundreds of micro influencers, is there a way to approach that sort of campaign?
Yeah, so I mean the same issues apply, and you may get away with it most of the time. But if you get caught, then the ASA or the Competition and Markets Authority or Trading Standards would take the same approach, and they'd ask whether that content was appropriately labelled. And it's clear from the ASA's annual report that influencers are a continuing area of focus for them. Now, to date, the people who have tended to be caught out are the people in the middle, so not the absolute mega celebrities and not really the micro influencers, but often the people who are influencers, but that's just one income stream. So the Love Island contestants, the Made in Chelsea, Only Way is Essex stars and the like have tended to be the ones who are caught out. But the same rules apply to all. With the micro influencers, you're looking at ways to get the appropriate protections in place, which are not administratively burdensome. So you're looking at template documents, which you can use across large numbers of influencers. You're looking potentially at document automation. You're looking, as you said, you're looking at practical guidelines which you can circulate rather than just relying on an influencer's own knowledge of the law.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dan. We are at time now, so we've got our contact details on the screen if you would like to follow up with any of us, and they'll also be in the follow-up email that you will receive. Just a quick plug for the remainder of this webinar series. We're doing this monthly so that you've got a whole month to get excited about the next one. The next one being on the 11th of November, and it's with Kate Swain, and that's about brands. Then we've got you have the dubious pleasure of me talking to you about designs on the 3rd of December, and then the new year, Kami Salhan is going to talk about copyright. So lots to look forward to. Don't think this autumn is going to be depressing when you've got a series like that to look forward to. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining, and thank you again to Kate and Dan for an excellent run through of a lot of different advertising issues. And we wish you all the best for the rest of your week. Thanks for joining.